I'm honored to be back at the archives, and I thank the archives and the Friends of the Archives for giving me an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects, RLY Peyton. RLY Peyton was a Missouri politician, and I'm going to take a few minutes to very quickly take you through his life and what he experienced as a Missouri politician. So, Robert Ludwell Yates Lud Peyton was born in Virginia in 1824. And the announcement that came out about tonight's presentation mentioned the fact that he was a largely obscure and unknown politician. I would probably argue that based on my experience over the last few years in researching Lud, he was actually an unknown politician to people in Missouri and most of the people unfamiliar with Missouri's antebellum Civil War history. So, with that, we'll begin. And from here on out, I'm going to explain and talk about Lud as if he were my best friend, Lud Peyton, not Robert Ludwell Yates Peyton. And he was named for his uncle, who died shortly before Lud's birth. So even though you may not have heard of Lud, I'm sure that you may have heard of some of the people that influenced his life, shaped his career, and had an influence on what happened in Missouri history. So as you can see on this slide, this is a constellation of people that had an impact on Lud during his life. So I'm not going to go through every individual on the slide, but I am going to list some of the names out. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Joseph R. Davis, Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Governor C.F. Jackson, Senator David Rice Atchison, Sterling Price, Jefferson Davis, Jeb Stuart, and Hiram Revels. So these are folks that even though you may never heard of Lud, you have heard of the people that influenced his life. So how did I end up writing about Lud Peyton? For the last 17 years, I have devoted all of my research time and interest in Missouri's burnt district. And I have spent many hours and many days trying to recover Western Missouri history that disappeared during the Civil War. My primary focus is on families and communities. And my time period of interest is 1840 to 1870. I became interested in Lud Peyton because he came from the Missouri Burnt District. And in my first two books, Caught Between Three Fires and Cinders and Silence, Lud played a role in the history of both Cass County and the Missouri Burnt District. So what is the Missouri Burnt District? As you can see on this slide, if you'll look on the right-hand side of the slide, there is a red arrow that points to where the burnt district is positioned within the state of Missouri. 3 counties, Jackson County, Cass County, and Bates County, and just the northern portion of Vernon County, compose what was the Missouri Burnt District. In 1860, the burnt district contained 2,200 square miles, 2,800 families, 2,800 homes, 2,800 farm barns, and outhouses. There were 3,000 miles of 6 and 8 rail fencing in the Missouri Burnt District. There were 40,000 residents, about 34,000 free white settlers, and the rest being slaves, about 5 5,500 slaves. Harrisonville, which is where Lud Peyton lived, is represented by the green oval in the center of Cass County. Harrisonville was the county seat of Cass County. From 1861 to 1863, the area you see on this map, the Burnt District, was ravaged by Lane's Kansas Brigade, the Kansas 7th Cavalry. Over 10 towns and villages were destroyed during that period. West Point, the largest city in the Burnt District right on the border in those days, was destroyed in 1861. Dayton in Cass County was destroyed in 1862. Pappinsville in 1861. So by the beginning of 1863, much of the 2,200 square miles outside military stations had been flattened. John McCorkle, one of William Quantrell's men, commented that we had just had enough. In August of 1863, they raided Lawrence, Kansas. When they returned to Missouri, Thomas Ewing issued General Order number 11, and that order resulted in the rest of the Burnt District, all the homes, all the barns being burned to the ground. All the civilians were turned into refugees and they left. It was cinders. So when I began my research, I tried to develop a list of all the people that lived in the Burnt District. And I was in Liberty, Missouri, reading an old newspaper from 1864 when I read this quote. R.L.Y. Peyton, formerly of Cass County and a member of the rebel Congress, died in Mississippi last fall. Well, Peyton wasn't on my list. So what caught my attention was that he had lived in Cass County. What really captured my attention was that he'd been a member of the rebel Congress and that he died in Mississippi in 1863. So my curiosity raised. Over the next 18 years, my curiosity helped me pursue these 18 words. And that is, who was R.L.Y. Peyton? And what role did he play in Missouri history? This is the only known surviving picture of Lud Peyton. He was born in 1824 in Loudoun County, Virginia. In 1832, his family moved to Oxford, Ohio, where he attended Miami University. He graduated in the early 1840s, and soon after graduating from Miami University, he attended the University of Virginia. In 1844, he moved west to Harrisonville, Missouri, and he lived there working as a frontier lawyer till 1861. In 1858, he was elected to the Missouri Senate. And from 1861 to 1863, he represented Missouri in the Confederate Senate at Richmond, Virginia. He died September 3, 1863 in Bladen Springs, Alabama. The interesting thing about Lud Peyton is he died young. He never married. He never owned a farm. He just lived around, moving from family to family, and then he lived in the hotels in Harrisonville. He never pursued wealth or fame. Although he supported slavery and was an ultra-secessionist, he never owned a slave to the best of my knowledge. He did have a mulatto half-brother that he was raised with in Virginia and who moved to Ohio with him. Lud Peyton was a procrastinator, but he was beloved and revered by all the people in Harrisonville. But the story begins an American journey in Virginia. And to be a Missourian and to be from Virginia, I'll read from this slide. Virginia was with them, and the them being the Missouri people that had come from Virginia, the mother country, and classic ground. From it their parents had migrated, bringing wonderful accounts of the country, its heroes, sages, orators, and statesmen. Their children, born in the forest or on the prairies, turn to the venerable mother of states and statesmen with more than filial feelings. So throughout his life, even though Lud left Virginia young and lived in Ohio before coming to Missouri, he always identified himself as a Virginian. To give you an idea, I'll quote later from one of Harriet Beecher Stowe's books. So the Peyton family in Virginia were part of the landed gentry. They were part of the Cavalier class. Peyton's grandfather, Francis Peyton, helped found Loudoun County, Virginia. He knew George Washington and worked with Thomas Jefferson. The Peytons were slave owners, they were plantation owners, and they were mill owners. They were very active in all segments of Loudoun County. They were also civic leaders in the county. The Peytons of Virginia were a revered Cavalier family. They were one of the first families of the state of Virginia. In 1856, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel, and it was called Dread, A Tale of the Dismal Swamp. One of the families featured in her novel were the Peytons. The girls, and I'll begin with a quote, "The girl's mother, a Peyton, had come from a distant branch of one of the most celebrated families in Virginia, and Tiff had been a servant. And with a heart forever swelling with the remembrances of the ancestral greatness of the Peytons, he followed the young mistress in her life with long-severing devotion. He even bowed his neck so far as to acknowledge for his master, a man whom he considered by position infinitely his inferior. For Tiff, though crooked and black, never seemed to cherish the slightest doubt that the whole force of the Peyton blood coursed through his veins, and that the Peyton honor was entrusted to his keeping. His mistress was a Peyton, and her children were Peyton children, and even the little bundle of flannel in the gum tree cradle was a Peyton. And for him, he was Tiff Peyton, and this thought warmed and consoled him as he followed his poor mistress during all the steps of her downward course in the world. So that gives you some flavor for the high station the Peyton family had in Virginia, the station that Lud Peyton was born into. So from Virginia in 1832, the Peytons moved to Oxford, Ohio. And as you can see on this slide, they moved about 500 miles from where Cumberland is in Pennsylvania. The Cumberland Road goes through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and they ended up in Oxford, Ohio. Virginia in the 1820s was encountering a greatly diminished overall economy. Land values plummeted. Slavery became a political issue in the state. And the Nate Turner Rebellion in 1831 scared many Virginians, and they ended up leaving the state. So Peyton's mother, Sally, had a sister, Jane McGonigal, that lived in Oxford, Ohio. So as the Peytons considered where they were going to move, and as they began to head west, the McGonigals had already moved to Oxford, and I'm sure that Jane and Sally hooked up, and that's what led the Peyton family to Oxford. But for an 8-year-old Lud Peyton, traveling on the National Road was an education in and of itself. Between 1830 and 1840, 375,000 Virginians left the state and headed west, most of them on the National Road. In 1860, Missouri contained 40,000 transplanted Virginians. Only Ohio exceeded Missouri in the number of transplanted Virginians. So a little talk about the National Road. For Lud Peyton, 8 years old, you can imagine how it opened his eyes. The National Road was 64 feet wide. It was a macadamized road, 3 layers of rock. It was a paved road, the first paved highway in the United States. The bridges on the National Road were engineering feats. This road carried thousands and thousands of people all year round. There were grog shops every 20 miles. In the evening, Lud absorbed music, jugglers, gambling, wrestling matches. There was a sea of humanity. Every conceivable type of frontier person, civic leader, immigrant, all traveled on the trail. Because the National Road went east and west, as Lud and his family walked west, they were encountering always herds of cows, sheep, hogs, ducks. The sounds were incredible. Lud, as an 8-year-old, heard about the shades of death, one of the scary parts on the National Road. So by the time he reached Oxford, Ohio, he had covered 500 miles of the then American West. He had become a true frontiersman. The family landed in Oxford, Ohio, and Oxford was, in those days, quite frankly, a frontier town. And Miami University had only been chartered by the state of Ohio, and it had opened its doors in the late 1820s. A very symbiotic relationship existed between the town and the university. The Peyton family settled on an in lot where they paid rent every year to the university, and Lud grew up 2 blocks from Miami University. The university was chartered by the state, but it was in fact led by a Presbyterian ministers. Because it was the first west of the Ohio River and the Appalachian Mountains, it gained the title Yale of the West. It was a classic education university. The classes were all conducted in Latin and Greek. The studies were all oral. The tests were oral in Latin and Greek. Lud Peyton had to go to a grammar school and learn to be fluent in Latin and Greek to attend the university. One of the most important facets of his education at Miami University was he was a member of the R.L.Y Society, and this society was devoted to developing debate skills. It met every day. So by the time Lud graduated from Miami University, he had, for 3 years, been forced to develop the ability to think on his feet. He developed mental dexterity, and he gained great comfort in speaking publicly. Now, following Lud, his brother McGonigal also attended Miami. McGonigal, however, was not an academic. He was actually kicked out for bad behavior and disappeared into the family history. While at Miami University, Lud met many classmates from southern states. One of those classmates and a friend of his was Joseph R. Davis. Joe Davis had come to Miami University from Canton, Mississippi, and he was a nephew of Jefferson Davis, who 20 years later became president of the Confederacy. Lud Peyton's sister Fanny married Joseph Davis at Oxford in 1842. After Joe graduated from Miami University, they moved back to Mississippi. Later, during the Civil War, Joe was an aide-de-camp to Jefferson Davis, and he became a general in the Confederate Army. Also, while at Miami University, Lud came in contact with the Beecher family. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see Lyman Beecher, who moved his family to Cincinnati the exact same year that the Peyton family moved to Oxford. The two cities were only separated by 30 miles. Lyman Beecher founded Lane Seminary, and 2 of his children, Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, became abolitionists. So Oxford and Miami University were constantly, during Lud's school days, embroiled in the abolitionist debate. While Lud was a student at Oxford, Lyman Beecher actually came to the school for a week while Lud was a student and lectured to the students. So Lud had personal contact with Lyman Beecher. Henry Ward Beecher, Lyman's son, was also in Oxford on several occasions. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out after Lud had moved to Missouri, as well as the Dread novel. But I think one of the educational items for Lud was that he was baptized in the boiling waters of the slavery debate, as Southwest Ohio was a major debating point between the abolitionists and many families that came from Virginia and had brought their slaves with them. Although slaves were not actually allowed, they were all freed in Ohio. After graduating from Miami University, Lud had to make a decision what he was going to do with the rest of his life. And he chose law. And at that time, he probably had the choice of two strong law schools, one at the University of Virginia and one at Transylvania University in Kentucky. Both of these universities had a law curriculum that was focused very strongly on states' rights. Lud chose the University of Virginia, where he studied under one of the most famous jurists in the United States, Henry St. George Tucker. Henry St. George Tucker had just come to the University of Virginia Law School, and he had just finished writing a book, Lectures on Constitutional Law. Lud studied under Tucker and studied and absorbed the constitutional law that Tucker taught. And this was a very strong states' rights interpretation of the United States Constitution. In 1843, Lud graduated after just 1 year of study with a law degree that enabled him to practice law anywhere in the United States. And like many young men, the motto in those days was "Go west, young man, go west." And Lud Peyton headed west. He headed about as far west as he could in those days, to the frontier of western Missouri. And he settled in Harrisonville. I put this slide together because you may have thought that you didn't know anybody who was associated with Harrisonville. But in fact, Cole Younger, who became very famous during the Civil War, was a teenager during the 1850s. The Younger family settled in Harrisonville, and Lud's father was the mayor of Harrisonville in the late 1850s. Many years after Lud Peyton died, Cole Younger wrote that one of his fondest memories was sitting on a barrel in the Harrisonville Square after the stage had arrived, and they were reading the papers from St. Louis and Jefferson City. And this sketch came from my first book, Caught Between Three Fires, but you can see Cole Younger sitting on the barrel. Now that's not Lud Peyton reading the paper. That's Hamilton Finney, who was the circuit court clerk in those days. But Hamilton Finney and Lud Peyton took turns reading the paper. They were the only two people in town that the postmaster allowed to read. So for 16 years, Lud Peyton lived in Harrisonville before the Civil War. For the first 10 years, he basically lived as a recluse. As I mentioned before, he never married. He lived with friends, or he lived in the local hotel. But while he was there, he worked as a frontier lawyer. So on this slide, you can see that I've outlined on the map the 6th Judicial Circuit Court District, and it encompassed several counties in western Missouri. If you can look in the map in the bottom right hand corner to get an idea that shaded area is the 6th Judicial District. But basically Lud worked in Independence, Harrisonville, Butler, Papinsville, Warrensburg, Lexington, Marshall, and Georgetown. So as he traveled the circuit with other lawyers, he got to know the people that lived in western Missouri, and they got to know Lud. On the right-hand corner of this slide, you'll see the courthouse that Lud practiced law in during all those years. The courthouse, all brick, was finished, and it was modern in 1843, and it survived through the Civil War. As a lawyer, Lud practiced both civil law and criminal law. In civil law, he handled many divorces, and as a matter of fact, I found out in my research that when my great-great-great-grandfather got a divorce in 1857, Lud Peyton was his lawyer. He also handled a lot of debt cases, but probably his favorite was to handle criminal cases, and his most famous criminal case was the Preston murder trial. And you can see there's a picture of Lud Peyton playing a fiddle sitting on a wagon. This is where the legend of Lud Peyton began. He defended James Preston with Charles Sims, another Harrisonville lawyer. And as the story goes, it was obvious to everybody for miles around that James Preston was guilty. But as the trial ended, Lud Peyton rose and faced a packed courtroom. With bated breath, the ladies waited, and for 2 hours, Lud spun a tale of innocence and spun a tale of a man who had been wronged and had killed another man just in self-defense. At the end of the speech, women wept, and the jury came back with a not guilty decision. And instantly, Lud became a legend in western Missouri. So the legend of Lud Peyton began with the James Preston murder trial, but his education as an orator began with the Arrowdelphian Society at Miami University. In July of 1844, the first summer that he was in Harrisonville, the residents asked him to give the 4th of July address. They hoped to catch him off guard. He was only 19 years old. But he rose in front of all the settlers and gave a rousing speech, an electrifying 4th of July speech. And from that day forward, he was recognized as the best speaker in Cass County. So there's some quotes on this slide that were given by people who heard Lud speak. I'm only going to read one of them. But it's important to recognize that while Lud was alive in the state of Missouri, he was recognized as one of the most electrifying orators the state had. He was so now I'll read. He was an accomplished orator, a master of language and logic, fluent in speech and pleasing in manner. He was as terrible as a cyclone in denunciation and as biting as a wasp in his wit and sarcasm. In addressing juries and public assemblies, he made strong men weep with his pathos and could command shouts of applause from those who differed with him on his subject with his eloquence. And that's a quote from Warner Lewis, and the quote was given in 1904, 4 decades after Lud died. So here's Lud Peyton. He's a quiet frontier lawyer. Nobody knows about him. Only the people local. In 4 years, he became a force in the state of Missouri. And he became a force in the state of Missouri because he was awakened, he emerged, and he attacked. In those days, they would say, to the knife. The KansasNebraska Act in 1854 sparked a controversy in agitation and fighting between Missouri residents and Kansas settlers that persisted until the Civil War. Lud Peyton lived in Harrisonville. He lived in Cass County, and both the town and the county and the border counties in Missouri became immersed in the conflict over slavery. The people that Lud faced off against on the right-hand side of the slide are names that you may recognize: James Montgomery, Charles Doc Jennison, and John Brown. On the Missouri side, those people opposing the abolitionists: William M. Briscoe, well known in western Missouri; John W. Reed, who led Missouri forces at the Battle of Osawatomie; and David R. Atchison, who had been a senator representing the state of Missouri and led the Army of Law and Order during the Border War. In 1857 and 1859, the abolitionists took the initiative. And in 1860, Lincoln's election led to Russell Hines's murder, and things got very ugly. But in 1858, Lud was sent to Jefferson City and to the Missouri Senate representing the 14th Senatorial District. He represented Cass, Bates, and Jackson counties. Throughout his days as a politician, Lud Peyton was an ultra-secessionist, but he was elected to the state Senate from a very moderate electorate. The people that lived in western Missouri, even though they had been embroiled in the border war for 7 years, or 4 years by the time Lud was elected, were not ultra-secessionists. They were moderates. But what happened was that other potential candidates moved on to run for other offices, and the incumbent senator from western Missouri, from the 14th district, vacated his spot and moved. So Lud basically ran unopposed in 1858. He arrived in Jefferson City in December of 1858. He had only been in Jefferson City for a few days when John Brown led a raid into what became the Burnt District. John Brown's raid liberated slaves from Missouri. He burned settlers' homes. Settlers were killed, and a lot of personal property was carried back to Kansas. There were actually several abolitionist raids, but John Brown's was the most famous. Lud Peyton had only been a senator for 2 weeks when he took the floor to address the Missouri Senate the first week in January 1859. This was his cameo speech. Many people did not know who Lud Peyton was, but in his speech, to give you a flavor for the fire that he spewed, he referred to Kansas as an abolitionist den of the vilest kind, that the people there were building a black Republican army, that thieves, robbers, cutthroats, and lawless miscreants were invading Missouri, and that Beecher, that being Henry Ward Beecher, was standing between them, preaching murder and war. This was the first time that an ultra-secessionist had addressed the Missouri Senate with the tone that Lud Peyton carried. And it met with mixed reviews. Most of the states were moderates, so his speech caught them off guard. They gave him low marks on his speech, but those that agreed with Peyton's political position elevated him to a very high position. And very quickly, his political position in the state changed. To give you an idea of what happened between that January 1859 speech and the end of 1860, In September 1860, Lud was positioned on the same platform in St. Louis with two Missouri senators, Senator Trustin Polk and Senator James S. Green. And you can see from the newspaper clipping that I've included on the slide that people were encouraged to attend because speeches were going to be given by the greatest orators of the day, Trustin Polk, James Green, and Lud Peyton. 2 years before, nobody in the state had any idea who Lud Peyton was. And in 2 years, he had moved from an unknown young senator in western Missouri to one of the leading ultra-secessionists in the state. He became one of what they called those hot-headed boys in Jefferson City. In May of 1861, as Missouri tottered between the Union and the South, Peyton was one of those hot-headed boys leading Missouri into the Confederacy. This sketch was drawn by Brian Hawkins, who has done sketches for my other books. And you'll see that Lud Peyton, on May the 9th, 1861, addressed the crowd on the bluffs of Jefferson City. So you can see the state capitol behind him, the Missouri River. They raised the Confederate flag, and as the keynote speaker, Lud encouraged all Missourians to help lead Missouri into the Confederate cause. He became, in a very short period of time, one of Governor C.F. Jackson's inner circle. After Lud gave his speech, Jackson and the other members of the Confederate government headed west. And you can see on the map on this next slide that they went to Boonville, where Jackson took a small detour, went to his home in Howard County, and then met up with troops and headed south. Lud continued west to Lexington, Missouri, and then into Jackson County, where he met James Raines, who was recruiting Missouri State Guard members. They took their troops, and you can see the blue arrows, and they headed south. At Lamar, Missouri, they reunited with Jackson's troops, and the next day the Battle of Carthage was fought. And you can see that in the red oval. They continued to Cowskin Prairie, and later that summer they headed north. So the Missouri State Guard was led by Sterling Price, and Price's picture is on the upper right hand part of this slide. They headed north from the Cowskin Prairie up the Missouri border, and they fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. They fought at the Battle of Drywood Creek. They continued north to Lexington, Missouri, and Lud's 3rd Cavalry fought at Lexington. Most of the men in the 3rd Cavalry came from those border counties, and probably the most famous was Lud's Lieutenant Colonel Martin White. Martin White had lived in Kansas, and in 1856, at the Battle of Osawatomie, he shot and killed John Brown's son, Frederick. After that, he moved back to Bates County, Missouri, and then he joined Lud's 3rd Cavalry, serving as Lieutenant Colonel. After the Battle of Lexington, the Missouri State Guard retreated back to Neosho in the bottom left-hand corner. And at Neosho, Jackson had called an extraordinary legislative session. He called the legislature together, and they met at Neosho, and then they moved on to Cassville. So you can see on the map in the little red box how far south in Missouri they had moved. While they were at Neosho and again at Cassville, they issued articles of secession. They celebrated Missouri's secession from the Union in both towns. Lud Peyton is positioned on the slide in the middle because when the legislatures met, he orchestrated the Articles of Secession, the militia reorganization, and the forming of a Confederate congressional delegation. Behind the scenes, he worked very closely with David R. Atchison and Governor C.F. Jackson. At the end of this session in Cassville, Lud Peyton was named a senator to the Confederate States. By late December 1861, or early January 1862, the exact date has not been found, he reunited in Richmond, Virginia with his sister Fanny and his brother-in-law Joe Davis. He was back in Virginia. He was back in Virginia as a member of the Confederate government. But he was also welcomed into the household of Jefferson and Verena Davis. Peyton's sister Fanny had become a regular member of Verena Davis's little circle. She spent a lot of time at the Confederate White House. So Lud Peyton, this frontier lawyer, virtually 3 years before unknown, became a welcome guest at Jefferson Davis's home. He also worked with Jefferson Davis in the Confederate capital, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. This had been the Virginia state capital. It became the Confederate capital in 1861. So, Lud was in Richmond as a member of Missouri's congressional delegation, but it was not all smooth sailing. They faced a number of issues, and the first issue that I put in this slide is how deep is your love? The southern states, the deep south states, were always concerned about Missouri's commitment and love of the Southern Confederacy. So Missouri had to prove that they were in fact in love with the Confederacy. The people from Missouri were worried about how deep the Confederacy's love was for the state of Missouri. We were the furthest west and the furthest north Confederate state, and we needed the help of the Confederacy to defend the state. But there was always this tension between Missouri and the Confederacy in terms of commitment. The second issue that the Missouri delegation faced was the delegation itself. And you see on this slide below the two George G. vests being whipped in the House of Representatives. Missouri's delegation developed a reputation as being somewhat uncouth as compared to the standards, the genteel standards of Richmond society. So they were known to drink, they were known to carouse, and it created some issues for them in the Richmond society. The third issue and large issue that the Missouri delegation faced was Sterling Price. There was no love lost between Jefferson Davis and Sterling Price. Their issues dated all the way back to the Mexican War. David Rice Atchison, a close friend of Jefferson Davis's, was also not a friend of Sterling Price. So throughout the entire Civil War, there were issues with Sterling Price in the Confederate government, and it impacted the Missouri delegation. In the spring of 1863, the Confederate Congress took a recess. And during that recess, Lud Peyton headed west to hook up with Missouri troops fighting at Vicksburg. The Battle of Vicksburg was moving rapidly forward. In May of 1863, Lud left Richmond heading west. During his journey to Vicksburg, he got malaria. After he got malaria, he was moved to the Bladen Springs Hotel in Bladen Springs, Alabama, and there's a picture of the hotel as it existed when the Civil War began. It was quite a place. Normally, with malaria, Lud would have been able to take quinine, but because of the Union Army blockading the South, quinine was not available for treatment. And as a result, he died on September 3rd, 1863. Ironically, he died during the exact same period that Order Number 11 was being enacted and enforced in western Missouri during that 15 days that everybody had to leave. In the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, you'll see the Bladen Springs Cemetery. I visited the cemetery with my wife Nancy. It was 100 degrees. We were not able to find his grave, but someplace nearby he probably is buried. I haven't been able to answer every question or cover every base. I hope I've raised some questions in your mind. If you're interested in buying the biography of RLY Peyton, you can do that at www.tomrafiner.com. So if you go to my website, www.tomrafiner.com, you can buy the book. Thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting. I very much enjoyed telling you about RLY Lud Peyton. Thank you.
So I guess now is the time for applause and questions. So we have a couple of questions that have been submitted, but if you have other questions, just type those into the chat box there on Facebook, and we'll be able to ask those questions at this time. So the first question comes from Carol, and she said, why did he choose Harrisonville?
Well, I don't know why he chose Harrisonville, but in studying what frontier lawyers did, I suspect that he was right out of the university. Most young lawyers headed west in those days because the new county seats, as they were established, did not have lawyers in residence. So for a new attorney, if they surfaced in a county that had just been established, and certainly Cass County was a new county, it only had a couple of lawyers, they were able to get a start and hang their shingle out. I suspect he probably knew somebody in Missouri that directed him to Harrisonville, but I have not been able to find out what the clue was that brought him there.
Okay. So do you have any clues on how that he got the murderer off? So, I mean, you basically said he did it, and then he was found not guilty.
He was found not guilty. It was just the power of his oration.
Wow.
That swayed the jury.
So, if I can ask an archivist question, I
Sure.
guess. So, what source did you find the 3,000 miles of rails in? That was on your first or second slide, I think. So that's a pretty specific detail. So.
Well, what I did was I computed that. And I computed it by doing some research into how many farms there were, and by looking at Civil War claims, I was able to figure out from those claims an estimate of how many feet of fencing, how many acres of fencing each of these farms generally had. So it was a matter of math, really, to take the number of farms, and they all had 6 and 8 rail fencing, and then compute what it was. Now, during the Civil War, the reason it all disappeared was the bushwhackers and the soldiers used that fencing for firewood in the winter, and they used it to cook over in the summer.
So you use those claims to figure out how
Right.
much. Okay, interesting. So, and that actually is from your
My first book.
from your first book.
Right.
So, wow, here's a James Peyton asking a question, and might have to expand that a little bit. What was the name of the book that Harriet Beecher Stowe you were quoting from concerning Peyton's slaves early in the program?
Was Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. And she published that book. That novel was published in 1856. And obviously it didn't get the notoriety that Uncle Tom's Cabin did.
So it wasn't the same book.
No.
So let me see back here. So why did Southern elites send their children to Ohio for college instead of like Virginia or Transylvania or some of those places?
Well,
he was already there, but I think
right.
Some of the others on that slide maybe.
Well, the reason Joe Davis ended up at Miami University and a lot of young men from Mississippi was that a Miami University graduate had moved to Mississippi, and he lived in Canton, Mississippi. So he recommended that university to many of the young men that lived in central Mississippi, and Canton is very close to Jackson. So the reputation in the late 1830s grew that this was a good university, and it of course the curriculum fit with the beliefs that they had.